I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. About 10 years ago, I got obsessed with this idea that design could be a form of inquiry. Graphic design, the field I was trained in, didn't just need to be in service of some design problem that a client brought to me. Design wasn't just problem solving. It wasn't only a commercial enterprise. Design could also be a process of questions, of discovering new insights, a driver of personal expression, an activity driven by play, improvisation, experimentation, and research. This insight completely changed how I thought about the possibilities of design and the possibilities of my own work. In many ways, this show is rooted in this idea of design as a form of inquiry. When I think of practitioners who embody this idea today, I think of Chiu. From the beginning of his career, Jeremiah focused on making space for personal creative work alongside the client work he was doing. And I think you can see how that intentionality shapes everything he does. Jeremiah's work spans design, art, music, teaching, and community organizing. His studio, Some All None, operates at the intersection of design, music, and technology, and is focused on activating graphic design beyond a traditional commercial practice, working equally to reimagine its role in a capital society and to implement it as a tool for community organization and experimental expression. He's also an assistant professor at Otis College of Art and Design and a prolific musician and DJ. I was interested in having Jeremiah on the show to talk about how all these activities fit together. In this really wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the importance of maintaining space for personal work, how music and performing influences his design practice, and why transparency is the key that drives his teaching. This was an inspiring conversation with so many great insights. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you who help support the show each month on Patreon. Supporters get bonus interviews, a monthly newsletter, and all sorts of other content. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast to sign up and get immediate access to all of that bonus material. Thanks, as always, for listening, and here's my conversation with Jeremiah Chiu. For the last 11 years or so, I saw have been sort of writing a word that guides you for the year. And so in 2022, the word was time. In 2019, it was shift. 2015 was focus. And you just posted on Instagram a couple weeks ago that your 2023 word is the year of stretch.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that practice, and then tell me what stretch means for you and how you're kind of hoping that will guide you this year?
Sure. I mean, I think that for me, it wasn't something that followed the, I guess, like the structure of like a New Year's type resolution or anything, though, of course, it does sort of appear around that space or that time. I think it has a lot to do with just the nature of, in the fall, things sort of start to settle or shift in their own ways. And it kind of came to me as an idea of saying like, can I just like, I really want to make a change in the coming year or like push towards something, but what that something was, I wasn't entirely clear on. And so what happened in that first year was just more or less just like, what happens if I try this out and see what happens, and I can't remember exactly what the first one is. It's in my desk right over here somewhere. But what happened is, it's like, as an example, I had the year of collaboration, and it really came out of this idea that I was like, well, next year, what I would love to do is find more opportunities for collaboration. And so in having that be the word, what happened is that there were a lot of moments throughout the year that people would approach me with an idea or a project or an opportunity. And a lot of times with things that I would previously be like, I'm not sure if I would do this, or I'm not sure if I want to. And in that particular year, I was like, well, this is my word. So let's go for it and see what happens. And what that ended up teaching me is that I have to be more open to all of these ideas, to all of these experiences, and really just um, the sense of being a little bit uncomfortable is actually quite exciting,
Mm,
because it's not going to change me. I'm still going to stand my moral ground and maintain my ethics and integrity, but I will experience something that I may not have otherwise allowed myself to experience. And so that's why the practice is continued.
I love that. Tell me about this word stretch. Why is stretch like what is how does that sort of shape
Yeah.
what you want for this year?
So as this process has continued over the years, I really I let a word find me now.
Mm, mm.
As maybe woo woo as that sounds.
I get it. I know what you mean. Yeah.
But I think it's something that's like, maybe that what it actually is I'm following an intuition, or a
Mhm.
subconscious that lets certain things kind of float to the surface, and then they find me, and then I'm like, okay, if something starts to stick over the course of the year, that becomes the word for the next year. And intentionally, they are words that can be interpreted many different ways.
Right. I
So.
noticed that.
So, stretch is something that I guess with all of them, they really surprise me, throughout the year,
Mm,
because you have something like voice, for example, for some time, and I was like, I think I'm gonna use this to feel more confident in developing my voice, etc. And what it ended up happening was, yes, that did happen in some ways, and I was doing a little bit more writing um, and focusing on developing a publishing practice, but also I ended up working on a lot of sound pieces that just were about the voice, and it was
mm.
kind of way more literal than I had anticipated. And that sort of has continued on its own life. So, um, intentionally, it's something where I'm like, I may have some notion of where it may guide me, but really, it's always going to surprise me, and embracing, what that change can be.
The reason I wanted to start with that and ask you about that is because I feel like it is a nice way to sort of talk about all of your work. Actually, there is this sort of self-reflexivity in your work. There's this sort of taking into account the type of work you want to do, the type of person that you are, and then how that manifests itself, whether that is design or teaching or music. And when you started when you co-founded your studio Plural back in the late 2000s,
Right.
you had this sort of like mission or mandate or goal that 50% of it would be self-initiated work versus sort of client work. And I was struck by that so early in your career, this sort of desire to make space for yourself, for work to find you. Where did that come from, or what was the goal there, or what were you sort of hoping to do with that 50-50 split? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, and I think 50/50 is like a little bit of an arbitrary number. It was just that, like, we wanted to make sure that we maintain a practice that is personal, that is
Right.
research based, that is investigative, and exploratory, and that those things may inform how we think about running a quote unquote traditional studio practice, or design firm, or whatever that ends up being. um, so much of my background prior to going to graphic design school, the program that I was in was art and design, and so it really
Mm,
overlapped between an art practice and a design practice, and you were kind of learning the mechanics, or the theory of both
right.
simultaneously. And I think when we were leaving grad school, and it was myself and Renata Gra and Chris Kalis, and we um, decided, why don't we use this, spend the last moments of our time here to see what we can do right immediately after.
Mm.
The studio was really started because at that time, my thinking was like, well, this is pretty much the lowest overhead I'm ever going to have, right? I'm already
Right.
used to living like a student, I was living as a student. And so then my responsibilities, my bills, all of this sort of
Yep.
stuff, I was like, these are kind of, they're only going to increase from here on out.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds so familiar.
So,
Yep, I know that feeling.
so let's give it a go. I have a little bit of like I can make it through a couple months if we just push and see what happens. And that's kind of what it really grew out of. But, in my own approach, or my sort of practice, is that I don't turn any of these things off, and I don't silo them. The
Mm,
work and ideas in design and in art and in music sort of all weave with each other, and they feel to me like a singular practice. And it's been a long, basically a lifelong struggle to define what that is, or to have other people understand how that might exist.
Can you talk more about this idea of seeing them all as one, as not
Right.
separating them? Was that a process? Did it take time for you to be able to say, this is music, this is design, but it's all similar, it's all one thing in some way? I think one of the themes of this show, and one of the sort of constant struggles in my work, is that articulation of different sort of modes of working. You talk a lot about this idea of hybridity, which I
Right.
really much relate to. How do you come to arrive at seeing these as all the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it took time for me to one, feel confident in it, and
Yeah.
two, to kind of really understand what uh my individual perspective or voice was in that. But in terms of the process or the practice itself, w- as an example, when I'm working in any of these spaces, they all share the same vocabulary.
Right.
So if you're making a work of music, you're composing something, and if you're making a work of design, you're composing something.
Mm,
So
mhm, mhm.
composition, balance, tension, story,
Right.
dynamics,
Rhythm, yeah.
rhythm, all of these things are things that we're taught in both, in any one of these practices, whether it's art, whether it's music or sound, whether it's design, whether it's any sort of creative endeavor. You're always working with the same vocabulary. And so to me, that was the most obvious moment of saying, you know, when I was shifting between one or the other projects, oftentimes they would be a little bit more separated, but I would end up using the same techniques or strategies. And in some
Right.
ways, like not having gone to music school and having that sort of uh, more of a rigid structure in how I was approaching that, it allowed me to be a little bit more free with that. And then um, in doing design for clients, as an example, I would say, like, why can't I use this strategy here? Why can't I bring
Right.
some of these ideas here? And it really did allow me to open it up, um, understanding that part of the way to achieve these um, things with client work is to be able to explain these ideas as well.
I mean, what's interesting is that you've worked mostly independently, but you had this sort of short period in the middle of your career. You were a art director at Compass, and then you
Yeah,
worked at Infoco. Both Adam and Shannon have been on the show before.
right.
Um, did that sort of hybridity or intersection? Can you talk about that in the context when you're working for somebody else, and how
Sure.
that shifted those dynamics a little bit?
Yeah, I think that, like, I've thought about this a lot, because it's like, when we first started building a studio, of course, like a lot of the studio goals in the beginning are to like grow a business and to learn how to do business in the first
Mm,
place, but also to grow sort of like a a visual appearance, so that people recognize you and see you, and you kind of exist in the circuit, of
right.
people practicing design in the world. And when I started to look more and more at who was doing that, all the different small studios around at the time, I was like, this is wonderful. I'm super inspired by it, but I also felt like I wanted to not only do that. And
Mm,
in some ways, like, there was a shift in which I was trying to um, bring more and more of my overlapping, practices together. And so I didn't necessarily um, take a sort of break in the middle and try these other things. I was sort of always doing these, because at Plural, we oftentimes would be hired by different
Uh,
agencies to do that kind of work. So we were working with all these agencies like um, VSA partners and Tribal DDB, and and so we had the experience of going into these spaces and having a team that we would lead and work with, and so I really started to understand and learn, the different scales of how design studios function. And when I made the move, so I moved to Los Angeles in 2014, and at that time, our practice as Plural was shifting in different ways, and it felt like a natural moment where I wanted to focus a little bit more on developing this practice. And Renata at
mm,
the time, we were the two partners at Plural. We just, basically there was sort of a natural
right.
difference of direction, and I think that stuff is okay. It wasn't the easiest thing, but it was also, I think, something that was really ultimately really necessary. But it really opened me up, and at that time the intention was just to say, like, well, I'm gonna try everything because I want these experiences,
Right.
and
Right.
this is just who I am as a person, in terms of like really having the desire to put myself into new situations where I might learn something from them, or what can I take from them. So, Compass approached me, and it was like, for me, I was like, there's no way, that
Right.
I,
It's the one part of your like
yeah.
resume that I'm like, wait, what happened there? Tell me more.
Yeah. Well, at the time, I was like, I'm running this independent practice, and it's a small studio, and then here comes this basically this startup that uh, bringing technology into the real estate market, similar to like how, well, not similar, but an analogous would be Uber bringing
Right.
technology into the you
Right.
know the ride sharing space. So you know when on paper it was like real estate and tech, and I was like, this is not me, or anything that I've done at all. But the proposal was to help build a West Coast design team, and
Mm,
launch different offices and hire a team and develop basically a design strategy that could impact sort of a national audience. And for me, I was like, well, when else am I going to get this opportunity or this challenge to face?
yeah.
And in a lot of ways, what I like is the challenge of saying, like, I have to put some things aside, and uh, I'm not, I don't want my ego to drive this decision. Though
Right.
it was very hard, because some people were like, why would you do this? And other people were like, you got to do this thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it was a great experience because I learned so much that year. And I learned also that, like, I didn't have to, it didn't have to be perfect on paper for me to go in and say, like, my approach or mindset should be one of bringing my best self there every day, and learning what I can learn, and seeing what I can take from this as well. So it felt, like certainly a different moment in my career, but it just felt like a good opportunity to also work with a ton of designers very quickly, and also not kind of navigate the space of how startups or tech companies function. So it was great.
Did working in that setting, and even your time at Infoco, which is like another sort of small studio that probably is more analogous to what you were sort of doing with Plural, did that change how you did the self-initiated work, sort of having those different types of constraints, being in those different environments? Did that change how you think about like that balance between self-initiating client and how you see those relating to each other? Can you talk a little bit about sort of what you took from that sort of evolved your own practice?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, what you gain is a confidence that
Yeah.
what you're doing is okay, and
Yeah.
and that, as long as you're, for me, I was like, I just need to keep growing. Um, I just realized, I was like, yeah, and thinking about how to run your own studio, you have the opportunity to make the decisions, but also that decision making is extremely hard, because you have to go fully uh, forward in it. You have to follow your intuition. You have to sort of have that belief that um, it can reflect your values and reflect yourself in a way that you feel good about. So, for sure, having worked at Compass, having worked with Infoco, having done any number of other, agency type or freelance type gigs, helped me form my own approach to the studio. But it really also helped me form my um, a strategy when working with clients. Because I
Mm,
think that for me, so much of it is that these days, um, I'm balancing teaching with running a design studio with, doing sound work. But it afforded me a little bit of space to say, like, if I'm taking on client work, in the beginning, I really want to make sure that not only that it's the right project for me, but that I'm also well suited to do the work.
right.
So I'm pretty, um, I'm pretty transparent, but also I ask a lot of questions before we even start to get into like working on something. So with even in developing a proposal for a project, I want to make sure, like, are you sure you want to work with me too? I think it's a question that I didn't always used to ask, because of course in the beginning you're kind of like, well, you have a budget and I don't have, and I need a budget.
Right.
So
Right.
maybe we should work together, because I just need to keep the rent paid or whatever. And now it's much more stable, as I've been doing this for the better part of 2 decades, and kind of understand how to approach this, but also can understand where opportunities exist um, to push the conversation forward and to create work that I think is really meaningful and impactful to the field.
It's a really nice way to talk about your current practice, some, all, none. I'm hesitant
Hmm.
to call it a studio, even though on the website you call it a studio.
Right.
Actually, on the description on the website is some, all, none. The studio is focused on activating graphic design beyond a traditional commercial practice, working equally to reimagine its role in a capital society and to implement itself as a tool for community organization, social activism, and experimental expression. That to me feels like a really nice articulation of what you were just saying. There is this focus here. There is a sort of mission behind the studio. What does that actually look like in practice? What does it mean for a graphic design studio to reimagine its role in a capital society, to implement itself as a tool for community organization, social activism, and
Right.
experimental expression?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, like, I'm an experimenter through and through. It's part of it, so much so that I'm like, I experiment with my design proposals to clients.
Right, right.
Every sort of step
We're
of the
so
way, I'm
similar.
like
Yeah,
rethinking.
yeah.
Um, but a lot of that description, I was like, is it still feels it could be more and more specific. But of course,
Mm,
the idea was um, to say that, like, for a large part of the time that I've been practicing design, I've also been participating in all of these other communities. Doing sort of art practices or projects, doing music or sound works, and having all of those sort of communities overlap, but also being somebody that intentionally tries to connect people,
mm,
and spaces and places in between, but also to cultivate the kind of community or culture that I want to see flourish.
mhm,
And I guess an example of this is that for a long time in Chicago, I was working a lot. Well, I still do, with Ed Marzewski, who runs this, slew of different organizations on Chicago, in Bridgeport in Chicago.
mm,
Most notably, I've been working on this thing called Lumpen Magazine, which then evolved to Lumpen Radio. So it's sort of this FM terrestrial radio broadcast. And, the idea was always to connect communities, but also to give some space to um, underrepresented ideas.
Hmm.
And you know, I remember specifically, and I kind of reference this all the time, is like this experience of going to, on any given weekend or weekday. I'm a weekday goer these days. Kind of, I'm like, I like the weekday shows. But you know, going to something like an art opening, you know, a show, like a music show, and then a design, you know, panel or lecture. And who would I see at all three of
Right.
those spaces? And it ended up being, you know, like very few people that I could ever see at all of those three. But to me, they were like, they were so connected in being like, this is what informs my practice. This is what informs and what I want to see more people doing. And it was, for a long time, it was Sonnenzimmer, this group of Nick Butcher and Nadine Nakanishi in Chicago, that I was like, I would see them at all the
Mhm.
things. I was like, you are my people, you know? Um, but, you know, and a handful of other people like that too. But I really loved those overlaps. And so the practice for me was really like, how do I start to cultivate more and more of this? So, you know, my work developing something like a Twitch stream platform for artists and musicians to do something during the pandemic and do like you know, live streamed concerts, and then training all of these artists on how to do that feels like a design project to me, because my approach is
Right.
identical.
Right.
It's not segmented.
How I'm really interested. You've been teaching at Otis since 2019, and I'm always thinking about these questions through the lens of education, also, and sort of how you introduce and encourage ideas of hybridity, of multidisciplinarity, of community organizing, sort of, you know, all these sort of modes that you're talking about. How do these ideas translate into the classroom, or what is the relationship between your practice and your students?
Right. You know, I teaching has been really an amazing experience for
Hmm.
me. I think that I it keeps me on my toes, and I'm learning all the time, and it feels also one huge part of this practice, that all comes together. So yeah, education is firmly, you know, one of the parts
Yeah.
of this practice. And with the students, I kind of took this approach in right in the beginning. You know, I had been teaching a little bit before, but really didn't fully go into a full time teaching practice until recently. And what I decided to do was be as transparent as possible. That was the
Mm,
baseline approach, which is like, if you have a question, I will answer it as honestly as I can. You
yeah.
know, and this really
And do
has
you say
to.
that? Like, do you say
Yeah,
that to
yeah.
students on the first day?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love
Um,
that.
and I kind of remind them, because I want them to know, especially because, you know, what we do know is that our students eventually become the people that we hire and we collaborate with and we work with, and you want them to all exist in the world and be the
Hmm.
people that are making that change and pushing the ideas forward. And so I want to approach it not as you know, less hierarchical and more as like, you are all here collaborating with me, and I'm learning as much from you
Yeah.
as you're learning from me. So I'm super transparent with them, all the way to the point where I show them, you know, my day-to-day conversations and emails and
Mm.
proposals and everything. I'm just like, look, this is really how the conversation happens, from my perspective, so that you can gain some insight into how you might develop your own voice or your own practice in that same situation that you'll certainly be confronted with at some point. So you know, I think that I bring them that transparency, but also I do it so that they can see that, um, what I've learned over time is that if you're trying to make a living as an artist, no two artists do it the same way. You
Right.
know,
Right.
it's really a huge smattering of different approaches. So you might find that another artist is like, I do, uh, you know, set design, and then I make these objects, and then I do these other events, and this is kind of like my own collection of ways that I make my living. And I want to open that up so that the students see that there isn't just a singular path. Because I do think that a lot of what I experienced in design school and just seeing how other design programs function is that there is a little bit of a funneling
Yeah.
into certain industry. And while I think that that may be completely practical and necessary and helpful and desirable for a lot of students, that uh, there's an equal amount of students that are seeking other approaches to forge a practice that aren't as apparent or obvious out there. So I really am looking for that opportunity to be like, you can do so many things with this, and what I'm teaching you, and this is in the syllabus as well, but we kind of break it down to like technique and and culture, you know. So like
Uh,
I can teach you the technical skills. Anyone can learn the technical skills, but what I can't teach you is how to um, be yourself, you know, how to find yourself. You have to kind of do that work, and I can guide you, but I can't tell you what to be.
that's exactly sort of why I was asking that question. And you started to hit on this a little bit in that answer, because I like to think that I try to do the same thing, and I've somehow cobbled together this disparate group of activities that I do that, sort of, make up my life. And I see that in my students at every institution that I've taught in. So this is not, um, a sort of singular idea. Is this desire to work across mediums,
Mhm.
to bring in things that are outside of design, this tension of like, I can't tell you how many times I've had students say like, hey, I want to do this thing for this project, but I'm worried that it's not design.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't
Absolutely.
care. Like, there's the old, I think it's Richard Hollis, who has this line in an interview that I've sort of borrowed and adapted a little bit, where he's like, graphic design is anything made by a graphic designer.
Right.
That's what I kind of always tell my students. Um, but there is this, on the other hand, there is this funneling, whether it's funneling into specific industries, whether it is this like, tracks within a program. Here's like the interactive track or the branding track, and there's this sort of desire to, there is talk of multidisciplinary, but then sort of the reality is actually discouraging that in many ways. And I'm
Right.
I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about that. And you started to say that with this sort of move between culture and technique, but how you think about, students who are in your class who, you know, probably many of them are taking out loans and
Right.
debt to be there, and are thinking, I want to do all of these things, but I also want to get a job and support myself.
Right.
How do I bring these together? How do I sort of think through this? How do you sort of talk with students about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, you know, the first thing that I make sure to establish and really kind of remind throughout the semester with students is that um, this is a place of respect. You know,
Hmm.
we all have to come to this space with the understanding that each of us has different desires. Each of us comes from different backgrounds with different experiences and skill sets, and that there isn't a better approach for each person. That they have to make these choices a little bit on their own. So,
Right.
you know, I think that that's a hard, oftentimes a hard thing to explain or show because of course, you know, for myself, you know, I'll have opinions on certain approaches to design, but I have to make sure that I maintain an unbiased sort of tone when talking about that stuff, because for everybody some of that stuff might be completely necessary and the best fit for different people. It might not be best for me, but I want people to know that it might be perfect for them. And
Right.
that's a hard, you know, that's a hard line um, to maintain, because you do want to make sure that you're giving enough space for everybody to find their own opportunity.
I mean, this is maybe a nice way to talk about a project you did a couple years ago, Outer Space, that is sort of this course workshop. It was a
Right.
book published by Slanted that I think deals with a lot of these issues. In the intro to that, You're right. From an educator's perspective, it may seem obvious to teach as we have been taught, but too often education is taught in binaries, right and wrong, or through biases, subjective goodness as a measure of quality.
Right.
This book proposes that we reestablish the hierarchical balance between teacher and student. Can you talk a little bit about that project and what you learned from that and how that sort of influences your teaching now?
Yeah, this is a good example of me turning a course into an experiment.
Yeah, I
But,
thought so.
but firmly asking, this was completely conducted on online because it
Mm,
was right during the, summer of the pandemic. And so, I sort of developed two uh courses. This is a month long, basically intensive. And on the first day of class, we kind of took a poll, and I was like, here's two possible ways we could do this class.
oh, wow.
I could teach you the things that you think you came here to sign up for and want to know, and that's totally fine. Or we could do this experiment together, which
I
I
love
will,
that.
sort of poured in these ideas, but like it may feel at times confusing or frustrating or challenging, but are you up for it? And these are students that were going into college, so they're high school level,
Oh,
and
wow.
so intentionally, I was like, let's see what we can. I want to see, um, what they're capable of, and also just knowing that they all come as young people with a very high level of understanding of the world. I don't want to dismiss anything because of their age, right?
Hmm.
But actually understand them as completely capable, high functioning humans. And so, it was an experiment in the sense that we broke it down into some pieces, but really allowed us to start to ask questions. And I think at that time, that moment between high school and college is of course volatile, but also quite interesting because you're kind of learning that you can think for yourself,
Right.
um, and it's no longer. I think the hardest shift that I see from people coming from high school to college is that their primary concern is grade,
Hmm.
and it's like, let's not worry about grade here. Let's actually try to think through some ideas together and see what you care about. And I don't know that they're always asked that. I think I had a great high school experience, and in that I did have a teacher that was asking us similar questions and just trying to really engage us for ourselves. And I don't know that that always happens, but I wanted to use this opportunity to say, like, could we actually forge something? And then, the book itself kind of came near the end of that because the conversations were so rich, and the experience was so good, and they were fully in. They were just like, this is all I'm doing for these weeks in the summer. I'm all in. Let's go.
Yeah.
And I was like, we can actually turn this into a book. Do you know, like, you could have a published thing that your name is on by the end of this course? And they were like, let's do this.
Right.
Um, so it was very cool to try this out.
This is not the question that I was going to ask you after that question, but hearing you say that, makes me think of questions of grades, of critique.
Hmm.
I think the critique, like the studio critique in design school, is so fraught with a type
Right.
of politics, a type of social hierarchy, who is confident and not
Exactly.
confident, how close are you to what the instructor is expecting. Like, even, no matter how hard I try to kind of have this openness and this sort of individuality, there's that stuff always emerges. how
Yeah.
does how does thinking about design this way, how does thinking about design education this way change how you think about critiques, evaluation, relationships between how students talk about the work of their peers? How
Right.
does that sort of happen in the classroom?
I mean, it's as to no surprise, it's something that I've been pushing in
Yeah.
different directions. But what has been happening lately is that we call it. I call it conversation now. So at Otis, we co-teach, and so the two people I or usually it's two to three people that were co-teaching a course together when they kind of
Ah.
group them up together, and it's really nice because you're able to gain different perspectives from different people from week to week. But in terms of the critique and the role of critique, it is something that there is a section in the syllabus that talks a little bit about the historical precedent of critique coming out of you know a certain kind of
Hmm.
Eurocentric art
Hmm.
school education, and what are we trying to gain from this, and what are we actually trying to do. And so what I've done lately is I developed this thing that I just called the critique or the conversation worksheet, and it uses an example that I found um, in art forum when I was reading sort of an article, and it just so perfectly broke down somebody's artwork and described it. And I use that as an example or a reference point, which
Ah,
then takes all the different ways that you can analyze a work and breaks those down. So then you also have the vocabulary listed there, which you can, of course, riff or expand upon. But what it does is it just breaks it down into ways of looking and analyzing work. So, it's formal, it's conceptual, it's historical, and how do those things all come together? So, we try to, I'm really trying to remove um, the structure of critique is as in like, a small group of people standing around a thing looking at it, and then who feels the most
right,
confident to publicly speak always gets,
right.
sort of comes forward. I don't think that that benefits everybody always. So we've included writing in it now, so it's like take a moment to actually analyze the work and write it out, and
Hmm.
and you can also write it in your own language if English isn't your first, right? And so there's all these different opportunities here that I'm trying to make sure students can start to that students don't end up feeling like, oh, I can't do this because it doesn't cater to my personality or my it puts me on the spot, and I think that there's other ways to do that.
I am so fascinated by written critiques also. I mean, maybe that's just because I'm a writer, also, and I sort of think that way, but I've done experiments with written
Right.
critiques. And I've done things that are sort of loosely adapted from sort of what Elliot Earls does at Cranbrook's, but,
Right.
in a very like, sort of simplified way, but where students sort of present work one week and then students go off for a week and write about one of their classmates' work and then come back and we do this like reading together, and they were always so powerful. It was like the best critique. It was, the things that the students could sort of talk about and wrestle with when they had time to actually look at another work over a course of a week or a couple days and then
Right.
write about it.
Right.
And the class went long and nobody left at the end of class, because we just kept sort of reading these. And so it's nice to hear that you sort of have been
I
experimenting with
mean,
that.
if you think about what you're doing in those spaces, let's, for any of us, let's imagine that we come to a space, like you go to an art opening with your friends, and then they're like, critique this right now. And it's like, part of this is a mode of like, well, are you a good improviser?
Right.
And also, what is your reaction? Like it becomes reactionary in a lot of ways because you're forced to articulate your ideas about something on the spot, in the
Hmm.
moment. and
Hmm.
and I think that like, of course, writing is going to work because then you have to sit down and think about the thing and then organize your thoughts, and articulate them. So it feels like that's a kind of like a no-brainer that you would take some time in between looking at a work, so that you can experience it and engage with it and be thoughtful about what you might say about it.
I want to completely change the subject as we head
Yes.
towards the end of the conversation because you've talked about music throughout this, but we haven't actually talked about the musical side of your work. And so you've released solo albums. Sort of,
Hmm.
I don't have the language for
Yeah,
music like
yeah,
I
for
do.
sure.
Sort of synthy, kind of drony, ambient kind of music. Uh, how does that You talked a little bit about sort of how the language is similar between music and design, composition, rhythm. Uh, how does working in that medium, where there's no words necessarily, the
Right.
content is so different, how does that sort of overlap or diverge from everything that we've been talking about today, sort of the more visual kind of design work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, sound or music for me is just another expression or experiment to kind of investigate, because the way that it operates is so interesting to me in the sense that, like, when you make an album, um, it lives with people, right? And they may listen to it once and kind of have an experience, or some people will sort of repeat listen to it and it becomes part of their uh, experience
Hmm.
of the day to day and of their lives. And there's this connection between memory and sound that I think we can all understand, which is like, if you hear a song that you used to be obsessed with as a teenager,
Right.
forever it sort of lives with you and experiences with you. So I think that expression is quite interesting, not dissimilar from like a sound installation that can change the environment quite a lot. So,
Right.
for me, it seemed like a natural extension or connection where, when I'm approaching the development of any of these different works, they're kind of always, they all start as ideas, but they may take any form. One might be visual, one might be sound. But I am somebody that enjoys, I work with synthesizers and I have for a long time, because I like the tactile nature of it and also the opportunity to like not be on the computer
Right. Right.
doing that stuff. Um, but I like engaging my ears as much as I like engaging my eyes, and that sensibility is a different one that I think can be really quite emotional and quite human. So, there are things that for me connect the same way that you might see a work of design that's like, I've never seen anything make this connection to my experience the same way, and it can sort of change you.
I want to make sure this question is not overly reductive, but I'm wondering if you think at all about ideas of authorship
Mhm.
differently in design work and music. And the reason I ask that is, so often as designers, you might get credited somewhere maybe at the bottom or it goes on your website, but often when things are out in the world, your name's not right at the top of it. But when you're
Right.
when you're making an album and you're thinking about these collections of songs are going to go together and my name's going to be on
Right.
it, does that change your approach at all, or how you sort of think about what makes a Jeremiah Chiu album?
Sure.
You know what I
Sure.
mean?
I mean, oh yeah, you can. It's like endless, the endless struggle of being like, do I call my studio a name? Do I have
Right.
a band name? And
Right.
they're all the same. And my partner will have heard me every couple months be like, I'm changing everything.
Right.
Um, and part of it is, it's like, when your name is on it, you're exposed. You're vulnerable to whatever might happen out there. And it takes a lot to let go of that and to just say like, well, um, it's okay, if you put something out there and somebody just hates it with a passion, because if they hate it with a passion, then they care in some
Right.
ways, right?
Right. Right.
And vice versa, of course. Some people it can make a really big impact on, but kind of leaving yourself vulnerable. I think for me, it's been a challenge, in the sense that, um, I've certainly had band names. I've played in bands. I've had studio names. I've changed those several times as well.
Hmm.
um, from the design perspective, the one of the main reasons that I keep the studio name is just so that it appears larger than it is. you know,
Of course.
um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
and in a lot of ways, it gives me that flexibility to say, like, if a project comes in that's quite large, for whatever reason, some people will be like, "Is this just you, or is your studio?" And there's kind of like, for me, it's like, does it matter if I can hire the
Right.
right team to do this project? And
Right.
it just kind of has allowed more doors to be open than
Yeah.
closed. So
Yeah.
I
I
keep the
mean,
studio name.
but that's kind of why I was asking, is because you have the studio name, you
Hmm.
have Some All None, but your
Right.
music is under your name. You're
Right.
not, your album is not under the moniker Some All None. And I
Yeah,
was sort of curious
exactly.
about that.
Well, what's interesting is, because the approach in the music lately also has been that I do a lot of collaborating with other people, and
Mm,
so it's become easier to not have it be like a band name or a moniker, because if you end up being on all of these other releases, that it becomes clear, this person, and in some ways it's like it follows the sort of structure, like the of like how jazz records were made. You know, it's like they have
Right.
the person's name on it, and you have all the names on it
Right.
as the band name, versus it being a singular group that may function more consistently together.
I'm curious about performing
Hmm.
and sort of the nature of live performing and what you've learned about your creative practice in playing this music in front of people,
Sure,
sort of,
sure.
not just thinking about this as something that's recorded and people listen to on their own, but, the sort of communal aspect of listening and you playing this in real time. Has that
Right.
changed these other endeavors, whether that's teaching or design? How do those all fit together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great question. I know that I focus a lot of time into thinking about what a performance is and what it
Mm,
means to be in front of people doing a thing. And so, like, as an example, when I do a lecture on my practice in a situation that may be either academic or more sort of like traditionally graphic design, I approach that as a performance as well. So
mm,
the way that I set up the slides or the presentation or the narrative is one that I'm trying to tell a story versus
right,
and do a performance. It really does feel like a performance in the same way. And in performing music live, it's not just a sort of a rote memorization of like, here's what you heard on the record and here it is played, but there's a
right,
lot of room for improvisation and for reaction, and for surprise. um, for me, what's super interesting and what I love is to see once again the human quality of these things, so that you didn't pull it off perfectly, but there are these moments where I can actually feel you in the
mm,
performance or hear you, in the sense that, like, even with electronic music or electronic instruments, so much of it can sort of get to a point where it's like it's uh it's dialed in and it's the
right,
same every single time. But I try to use that as an instrument and say, like, well, where are the moments that this can be really volatile, or that I can actually, it can all come crashing down at any moment.
right,
And then you're
right.
watching somebody navigate that struggle or try to pull it back together. And that's where the magic really lives for me. So
Oh, I love that.
I really love, yeah, thinking about sound, thinking about, also design that way too, where it's like when you're setting up something as an example, like a publication design or something, or a web experience, that they can have that same volatility in the sense that, like, you're trying to communicate something, you're trying to express an idea, but there are some moments that, like, the interaction or the dialogue between the audience and the author can shift this and make it tangible or make it real. So
Right.
I like the idea of that. Sometimes I'm open to just being like, well, let's just see what happens. That doesn't always net in success, but I think that that's okay too.
Yeah, I mean, I did not plan for that question to basically sum up everything that we've been talking about, but it did. It's experimentation. It's like,
Right,
hey, I'll go take this job because when else am I going to get to try
right.
this? And community and bringing people together and sort of thinking about collaboration. It's actually all there in live performance, which I did not realize when I asked that question.
Yeah, me either. Absolutely.
Well, I think we should just end with that since that was a nice
Great.
summary. So I'll ask you the question that I use to end all of these. I'm curious
Mhm.
what you're reading right now.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this, and I have a
Okay,
stack of things because
great. I
I'm
love it.
such a sporadic reader. Because when I'm in school mode, I'm like reading, you know, uh, mundane
Yeah,
texts
yeah,
sometimes,
yeah,
or
yeah.
things like that. But
Oh, I know. I get it.
currently my stack of books, I have this great book called Teaching Graphic Design. Um, I have one that's called The Professor is In, which I
Uh,
actually started to share some excerpts of with my students that I thought were really helpful in terms of like learning about interviews and grant opportunities and how to sort of
mm,
do this. It's by Karen Kelsky, and it's the essential guide to turning your PhD into a job.
nice, nice.
But I've also am reading On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean
Oh,
Vuong.
that's a great book.
Yeah, so several different things. I'll stop there. There's a
Yeah,
stack.
that is a great collection. Jeremiah, I'm a fan of you and your work and really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the time and the questions and the conversation. It was great.
This episode was recorded on February 3rd, 2023. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.